The darkness has a way of hiding the most terrifying secrets of the world, wrapping them in shadows until it is far too late to escape. I have spent my entire life trying to forget what happened during that brutal winter in the dense, unforgiving woods outside of Portland. We lived entirely off the grid, a solid 5 miles away from the nearest paved road or neighbor, surrounded by towering pine trees that blocked out the sun even during the day. It was the kind of isolation that brought peace to my parents, but on the night the temperature suddenly plummeted to a bitter 10 degrees, that same isolation became our worst nightmare. I remember the paralyzing fear that gripped my chest the moment the wind stopped blowing. The forest outside our heavy wooden doors went completely dead. There was an oppressive silence, a heavy atmospheric pressure that made the hair on my arms stand straight up. We were being hunted. My family and I were trapped inside our home, entirely cut off from the outside world, completely unaware that a monster from our darkest nightmares was stalking us through the snow. But the most shocking truth of that night was not the horrifying beast trying to break into our home. It was the protector we already had inside with us. To understand the sheer magnitude of that night, you have to understand the creature we called our pet. 7 years prior, my father had gone out hunting on foot, hiking several miles deep into a treacherous ravine. He returned carrying a massive, shivering ball of dark fur. He claimed he found an orphaned wolf pup, nearly frozen to death, and decided to bring him home. We named him Buster, but as the months turned into years, it became glaringly obvious that Buster was not a dog, nor was he a normal wolf. By his 3rd year, he weighed easily over 200 pounds. His chest was unnaturally broad, and his front limbs were longer and thicker than his hind legs, ending in paws that closely resembled massive, clawed hands. The most unsettling thing about him was his intelligence and his posture. Sometimes, when he thought no one was looking, he would stand up on his 2 hind legs to peer over the tall wooden fences my father had built. When he stood, he towered over us, reaching nearly 7 feet in height. His amber eyes held a deep, terrifying intelligence. Yet he was fiercely loyal to us. He was a gentle giant around my mother and me, fiercely guarding our property boundaries. We ignored the bizarre anomalies of his anatomy, blindly convincing ourselves he was just a rare hybrid. We had no idea we were harboring a dogman in our living room. The true horror began exactly 3 days before the ultimate confrontation. The bitter cold had frozen the ground solid, and a fresh layer of snow covered the landscape in a pristine white blanket. I had walked about 2 miles out to gather some specific firewood when I noticed a series of massive indentations in the snow. They were tracks, but they defied all logic. Each footprint was easily 14 inches long, and they were bipedal. Whatever made them was walking on 2 legs, taking strides that spanned nearly 5 feet in distance. A deep, primal terror washed over me as I realized the tracks were circling our property line, pacing back and forth as if studying our defenses. I hurried back to the house, my heart pounding violently against my ribs. When I showed my father, the color drained from his face. Buster's reaction, however, was what truly terrified us. He refused to go outside. Our massive, fearless companion paced relentlessly in front of the reinforced oak door, his muscles coiled tight, his amber eyes completely dilated. The woods outside had fallen into a sickening quiet, devoid of any natural wildlife. The ecosystem itself was hiding from whatever was out there. The climax of our mounting dread arrived on a Tuesday evening. The sun had dipped below the horizon, plunging the forest into total darkness, save for the faint illumination of the moon reflecting off the snow. I was standing by the thick glass of the living room window, peering out into the freezing night, when a massive silhouette detached itself from the shadows of the ancient pine trees. My breath hitched, freezing in my lungs. Standing at the edge of the clearing, roughly 50 feet away, was an abomination straight out of ancient folklore. It was towering, easily 8 feet tall, covered in matted, wiry grey fur. Its shoulders were impossibly broad, and its head was a grotesque mockery of a wolf, elongated and twisted with malice. The creature dropped to all fours for a moment, its spine popping in unnatural ways, before rising back up on 2 massive muscular legs. This was not a dogman like Buster. This was something entirely different, something purely evil and infected with an insatiable bloodlust. It was a werewolf, a creature of pure nightmare, and its glowing yellow eyes were locked directly on the window where I stood. It began to close the distance to our home, taking slow, deliberate, terrifying steps through the deep snow. Panic erupted inside the house. My father rushed to grab his heavy hunting rifle, though we both knew deep down that standard ammunition would do absolutely nothing against a beast of that unnatural size and strength. The temperature inside the room felt as if it had dropped below 0 simply from the presence of the approaching monster. I backed away from the window, my entire body shaking uncontrollably. Then Buster moved. He did not act like a frightened pet, nor did he act like a wild animal cornered in a trap. He moved with a terrifying, calculated purpose. The gentle giant we had raised suddenly shed his domesticated disguise. Buster stepped in front of my family, placing himself directly between us and the heavy front door. Slowly, deliberately, our supposed dog stood up on his hind legs. The sheer mass of his body seemed to expand, his muscles bulging under his dark coat. He stretched to his full imposing height of 7 feet, his broad shoulders blocking the hallway. He looked back at me, and for the first time in 7 years, I did not see a pet. I saw an apex predator, a majestic and terrifying warrior preparing for a battle to the death. The werewolf outside let out a deafening roar that shook the entire foundation of our home, and Buster, our loyal dogman, stood his ground, ready to answer the challenge. To really make you understand the sheer terror of our situation, I need to paint a picture of exactly where we were. We didn't just live in the woods. We were swallowed by them. Our cabin was located deep in the untamed wilderness, at least 20 miles away from the city limits of Portland. My parents had built the place by hand, using massive, thick logs of timber and heavy iron hinges. We lived completely off the grid. There were no power lines, no modern conveniences, and absolutely no vehicles of any kind on our property. We relied entirely on our own 2 feet to get around, hiking miles through dense, overgrown trails just to gather supplies or hunt for food. The isolation was meant to be peaceful, but that winter it became our prison. The architecture of our home was sturdy, with thick wooden doors and heavy shutters, but against the pitch-black night it felt like a fragile wooden box. Inside, the only source of light came from a few flickering oil lamps and the roaring fire in the hearth. The temperature outside had dropped to a bone-chilling 5 degrees Fahrenheit, and despite the fire, a freezing draft crept through the floorboards, chilling us to our very core. The smell of burning pine and wood smoke usually brought me comfort, but that night it was entirely overpowered by a foul, metallic stench that seemed to seep straight through the walls. It smelled like raw copper, sulfur, and rotting meat. We were entirely alone, trapped in a frozen wasteland, with miles of deep, unforgiving snow separating us from any hope of rescue. The psychological weight of living that far out in the wilderness is something most people simply cannot comprehend. My father was a tough, stoic man, a hardcore survivalist who believed in relying only on himself. My mother was equally resilient, a woman who could skin a rabbit and mend a heavy winter coat without breaking a sweat. But that night, I saw the color completely drain from both of their faces. The woods around our property were usually alive with the sounds of nature, the hooting of owls, the rustling of small game, the howling of the wind through the massive pine branches. But leading up to this terrifying encounter, the forest had changed. Over the past 3 weeks, the ecosystem simply shut down. The deer vanished, the birds stopped singing. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. It was a suffocating dead silence that made your ears ring. When you walked outside, you constantly felt the heavy, paralyzing sensation of being watched from the shadows. The hair on the back of my neck would stand up every single time I ventured past the tree line to chop wood. We didn't know it then, but we were already trapped inside the hunting grounds of an apex predator. That dead silence was nature's warning system. Every living creature with a survival instinct had already fled the area, leaving only us, isolated in our wooden cabin, completely oblivious to the towering nightmare that was slowly closing in on our home. And then there was Buster. In the midst of all this rising, unspoken terror, our supposed pet was behaving in ways that defied all logic and reason. I need to make it incredibly clear, Buster was male, undeniably and intensely so. He possessed a raw, masculine dominance that commanded respect from everything around him. He never barked like a normal canine. Instead, he would let out a low, guttural vibration that you felt in your chest before you ever heard it with your ears. During those silent, tense weeks leading up to the attack, his behavior became incredibly erratic. He stopped sleeping by the fireplace. Instead, he would pace the perimeter of our wooden fence for hours on end, heavily pushing his 250 pounds of muscle through the deep snow. The most unsettling part was how he monitored the woods. He would walk over to the 8-foot-tall reinforced fence, stand up entirely on his 2 muscular hind legs, and just stare out into the endless sea of pine trees. His broad shoulders would tense, his dark, wiry fur standing on end. He was a sentinel, constantly searching the tree line for a threat we couldn't even see. The scent he gave off wasn't that of a wet dog. It was an earthy, musky scent of a wild beast, primal and deeply intimidating. He knew exactly what was out there in the dark, and he was actively preparing for a war. The horrifying reality of our situation began to fully set in when the sensory details of the nightmare crashed over us. Just before the werewolf actually stepped into the clearing, the atmosphere around our cabin became physically oppressive. The temperature plummeted even further, dropping well below 0 Fahrenheit. My breath plumed in the air inside our own living room. The heavy oak door was bolted shut, but the horrifying smell that had been lingering outside finally invaded our sanctuary. It was thick and nauseating, the unmistakable stench of a predator that bathed in the blood of its victims. It smelled like a mixture of a damp, decaying cave and an open slaughterhouse. I remember feeling a heavy, sickening knot form in my stomach. The fear wasn't just in my head. It was a biological reaction. My body was screaming at me to run, but there was nowhere to go. My father gripped his hunting rifle with white knuckles, his eyes wide and panicked, realizing how utterly useless the weapon was going to be. My mother stood frozen behind the heavy wooden dining table, holding a sharp skinning knife that looked like a pathetic toy in the face of what was coming. We were completely surrounded by a darkness so thick you could almost cut it, waiting for the monster to make its final move. The tension in the cabin reached a breaking point when the heavy, crunching footsteps finally began to circle the house. Crunch, crunch, crunch. The massive strides were slow, methodical, and incredibly heavy. Whatever was out there weighed well over 400 pounds, and every time its massive feet hit the frozen ground, the wooden floorboards beneath our feet vibrated. It was testing our defenses, walking past the windows just out of sight, dragging a set of long, sharp claws along the exterior wooden logs. Scratch! The sound was like nails on a chalkboard, echoing through the freezing silence of the cabin. The werewolf was playing a psychological game with us, letting us know that it was there, that we were trapped, and that it was only a matter of time before it found a way inside. The sheer terror of hearing a bipedal monster hunting you, listening to its deep, wet, raspy breathing through the walls, is something that fundamentally breaks your mind. It stopped directly in front of the heavy front door. The doorknob violently rattled. The monster let out a low, vibrating growl that shook the glass panes in the windows. And that was when Buster, our loyal, terrifying dogman, stepped fully into his true nature, standing at 7 feet tall, preparing to defend his human pack from the demon waiting on the other side of the wood. The terror of knowing an apex predator is actively hunting you from just a few inches away is a psychological torture I would not wish upon my worst enemy. We stood perfectly still in the center of the living room, absolutely paralyzed by the sheer size of the threat just outside our thick front door. The massive shadow blocked the moonlight shining through the frosted glass pane. My father slowly raised his rifle, aiming at the center of the wooden planks, but his hands were trembling so violently that the metal barrel shook. He whispered to my mother and me, ordering us to back away slowly into the main hallway. He knew that the heavy oak door would not hold if the beast decided to use its full, immense strength. The creature seemed to sense our movement. It stepped away from the front porch, and the heavy vibrations of its footsteps began to circle the exterior of our cabin once again. It was looking for a weaker entry point. The temperature inside the room felt like it had dropped to a bitter 0 degrees Fahrenheit, as if the monster was draining all the heat from the atmosphere. I watched Buster, a massive dogman, tracking the movements of the werewolf from the inside. He walked on his 2 hind legs, his posture completely erect, shadowing the beast as it paced outside the walls. Buster emitted a low, continuous vibration from deep within his broad chest, a soundless frequency of pure hatred and dominance that I could feel in my own bones. The werewolf was massive, but Buster was entirely fearless, waiting for the exact moment the enemy would try to force its way inside. The nightmare took a horrifying turn when the heavy impacts of the beast's footsteps suddenly vanished from the frozen ground. For a brief, agonizing moment there was absolute silence. We held our breath, praying the creature had given up and retreated into the dark woods. Then the ceiling above us groaned under an immense, sudden weight. The monster had leapt onto the roof of our cabin. The sheer power required to jump 15 feet straight into the air and land on the icy wooden shingles was unfathomable. The thick timber beams of our home creaked and strained as the creature walked slowly across the roof right above our heads. I looked up, completely terrified that the beast weighing easily over 400 pounds would come crashing straight through the ceiling. It moved toward the stone chimney. Dust, soot, and frozen ash began to fall heavily into the fireplace, covering the burning pine logs. The werewolf was trying to see if it could climb down the chimney shaft. The smell of sulfur and rotting meat flooded down into the living room, choking us, filling our lungs with the foul scent of the monster. My mother covered her mouth, her eyes wide with unadulterated panic, while my father aimed his weapon upward. Buster moved to the hearth, tilting his head back to look up the chimney. He bared his massive teeth, his amber eyes burning with a fierce, protective intensity. The creature above seemed to realize the chimney was too narrow for its broad, muscular shoulders, and the heavy footsteps began to move toward the back of the house. We moved as a single, terrified unit toward the back of the cabin, following the sounds of the monster above us. The kitchen was entirely dark, the only illumination coming from the pale moonlight reflecting off the endless snow outside. The beast jumped down from the roof, landing in the backyard with an impact that shook the entire foundation. It was standing right outside the heavy wooden shutters that protected the kitchen window. The creature did not try to pick at the wood. It simply grabbed the thick iron hinges and tore the entire shutter off the wall with a sickening display of brute force. The wood splintered violently, and the monster pressed its grotesque, elongated face directly against the thick glass. That was the moment I saw the werewolf up close, and the image is permanently burned into my memory. Its head was massive, covered in wiry, dark grey fur, with a snout that was pulled back to reveal rows of razor-sharp, jagged teeth. Its eyes were a glowing, demonic yellow, filled with an insatiable, malicious hunger. It was entirely evil. The creature stood up to its full height, stretching easily to 9 feet tall, its massive shoulders blocking out the entire view of the winter night. It slammed its huge, clawed hands against the glass. The thick pane held for a second, but spiderweb fractures immediately spread across the surface. We were entirely trapped, miles from any help, with a demon actively tearing our home apart to get to us. As the glass began to spiderweb, panic threatened to completely overwhelm my mind. I took a step backward, ready to sprint into the deepest corner of the cabin, but Buster stopped me. Our faithful dogman did not panic. He did not charge blindly at the window like a foolish animal. Instead, he displayed a level of tactical intelligence that was absolutely stunning. Standing at 7 feet tall, his massive, muscular frame dominated the small kitchen. He reached out with one of his long, powerful front limbs and physically pushed my father backward, forcing him away from the line of sight. It was a firm, deliberate push, with a hand that ended in thick, dark claws. Buster was entirely in charge of the situation. He placed himself directly in the center of the kitchen, creating a physical barricade between us and the fracturing window. His dark fur stood entirely on end, making him look even larger and more intimidating. He dropped his massive shoulders slightly, coiling his powerful legs, preparing for the violent collision that was about to happen. He never once broke eye contact with the werewolf outside. It was a silent, intense standoff between two apex predators, a battle of pure dominance. Buster knew exactly what he was doing. He was drawing the monster's full attention, ensuring that when the beast finally broke through, it would focus entirely on him and ignore my vulnerable family cowering in the hallway. The tension stretched so tight that the air in the kitchen felt incredibly heavy, suffocating us. The temperature outside had reached a brutal 5 degrees Fahrenheit, and the bitter cold seeped through the cracks in the fracturing window. The werewolf outside let out a deafening, guttural vocalization that rattled the pots and pans hanging from the ceiling. It pulled its massive right arm back, its thick muscles shifting under its grey fur, and drove its fist directly through the center of the window. The glass shattered completely, raining sharp shards all over the wooden floor. The freezing winter storm immediately rushed into the cabin, bringing with it the overpowering, nauseating stench of the beast. The creature grabbed the wooden window frame and began to pull, violently tearing the thick logs apart to widen the opening. Its massive head and broad shoulders forced their way into our home. The monster was inside. My father tried to raise his rifle, but the sheer size and speed of the creature left him completely frozen. The werewolf locked its glowing yellow eyes onto us, baring its teeth, ready to slaughter my entire family. But before the beast could pull its legs through the broken window, Buster launched himself forward. The ultimate confrontation had begun, and our home was about to become a war zone. The absolute nightmare of the situation peaked the second Buster launched himself across the kitchen. The werewolf had managed to force its massive upper body through the shattered window frame, its jagged teeth dripping with foul saliva as it reached its elongated arms into our home. It fully expected to find terrified, defenseless prey. Instead, it was met with 250 pounds of furious, fiercely protective muscle. Buster hit the invading monster with the force of a freight train. The physical impact of the two massive beasts colliding in midair was a devastating display of brute strength that shook the entire cabin. They slammed together against the kitchen counter, instantly destroying the heavy wooden cabinets and sending iron cast pans flying across the room. The werewolf let out a deafening vocalization of pain and pure rage. Entirely caught off guard by the sheer power of our defender, Buster did not fight like a wild wolf. He used his massive, thick front limbs like arms, grappling with the invading demon, tearing at its wiry grey fur with his thick claws. The temperature inside the kitchen was freezing, the bitter wind howling through the massive hole in the wall, bringing in flurries of snow that immediately melted against the thick, hot blood spilling onto the wooden floorboards. The sheer violence of the struggle was paralyzing. My family and I were trapped in the narrow hallway, completely unable to move or look away as these two titans of ancient folklore tore our home apart in a desperate battle for survival. The confrontation quickly spilled out of the destroyed kitchen and into the main living room. The werewolf was significantly taller and weighed easily 400 pounds, but it fought with a blind, chaotic fury, driven entirely by malice and hunger. Buster, on the other hand, fought with an intense, calculated intelligence. He stayed mostly on his hind legs, maintaining his imposing 7-foot height, using his broad shoulders to absorb the devastating blows from the invader. The horrific smell of the werewolf, that sickening mixture of sulfur and rotting meat, completely filled the cabin, making it difficult to even breathe. As they rolled and fought across the living room, they destroyed everything in their path. The heavy oak dining table, which my father had built by hand, was splintered into pieces under their combined weight. I could see the terrifying details of the werewolf up close as it fought to pin our protector. Its muscles writhed under its matted coat, and its glowing yellow eyes burned with an intense demonic hatred. It constantly tried to snap its massive jaws around Buster's neck, but our loyal dogman used his thick, muscular forearms to keep the beast at a distance. The sheer amount of violence happening just feet away from us broke something inside my mind. I was watching an impossible horror movie unfold in my own living room, entirely helpless, knowing that if Buster failed, we would be slaughtered in seconds. The situation escalated from terrifying to completely apocalyptic when the violently struggling creatures slammed heavily into the stone hearth of the fireplace. The impact caused the heavy iron grate to dislodge, sending burning pine logs and glowing embers scattering all across the wooden floorboards. Within seconds, the dry wood of our cabin began to catch fire. The thick, suffocating smoke started to fill the living room, adding a blinding haze to the chaotic nightmare. The contrast of the elements was absolute torture. A freezing 10 degrees Fahrenheit wind was aggressively blowing through the destroyed kitchen window at our backs, while the intense, blistering heat of the spreading fire scorched our faces from the front. The orange flames cast long, dancing shadows against the walls, illuminating the two monsters in a horrifying, demonic light. The werewolf seemed entirely unbothered by the flames, using its superior weight to finally push Buster back against the heavy stone of the chimney. The beast raised one of its massive clawed hands, bringing it down with devastating force across Buster's chest. Blood sprayed across the stones, and for the first time that night, Buster was forced down onto all fours. The werewolf towered over him, its jaws opening wide, preparing to deliver a fatal strike. The fire was growing rapidly, the smoke burning our eyes, and time seemed to slow down entirely as we watched our brave defender begin to lose the battle against the overwhelming size of the monster. Seeing Buster pinned against the burning hearth snapped my father out of his paralyzed state. He knew that if the Dogman died, we were entirely doomed. He raised his heavy hunting rifle, wiping the stinging sweat and smoke from his eyes. He knew standard ammunition would never kill a supernatural beast of that magnitude, but he needed to break its focus. The werewolf had its jaws inches from Buster's throat when my father pulled the trigger. The absolute volume of the gunshot in the enclosed, echoing cabin was deafening. The muzzle flash briefly illuminated the thick smoke. The heavy caliber bullet struck the werewolf directly in its massive right shoulder. It did not penetrate deeply into the thick muscle and bone, but the sheer kinetic force of the projectile caused the beast to stumble backward. The monster let out a terrifying guttural sound that vibrated the floorboards beneath my feet. It completely abandoned Buster, turning its massive, twisted head to look directly at my father. Those glowing yellow eyes locked onto him with a promise of absolute death. The beast took a heavy, terrifying step toward the hallway where we were hiding, its lips pulled back to reveal rows of blood-stained teeth. My heart entirely stopped beating. The monster was coming for us, and my father frantically tried to chamber another round, his hands shaking violently as the massive creature closed the distance. That brief second of distraction was all Buster needed. Our protector recovered with lightning speed, rising from the floorboards with a renewed, terrifying fury. As the werewolf took its second heavy step toward my family, Buster attacked from behind. He launched his entire 250 pounds of muscle directly onto the monster's back, wrapping his powerful long front limbs around the beast's thick neck. The werewolf thrashed violently, trying to throw the dogman off, but Buster held on with an iron grip. He used his immense leg strength to drive the larger beast backward, forcing it away from the hallway and back toward the ruined kitchen. The sheer force of Buster's counterattack was incredible. He physically pushed the 400-pound monster across the room, completely ignoring the spreading fire and the destruction around them. With one final massive surge of power, Buster shoved the werewolf violently through the shattered remains of the kitchen window. The heavy beast tumbled backward, disappearing into the pitch-black, freezing night outside, plummeting into the deep snow. Buster immediately stood at the destroyed window frame, his chest heaving, his dark fur covered in blood and snow. He stood tall on his two hind legs, looking out into the brutal winter storm, emitting a low, powerful vibration of absolute dominance. The threat was gone, pushed back into the shadows by the terrifying, loyal protector we had raised from a pup. The monstrous werewolf had been violently ejected from our home, but the immediate threat inside our destroyed living room was entirely catastrophic. The heavy iron grate of the fireplace had been completely dislodged during the brutal struggle, sending massive burning pine logs scattering across the dry wooden floorboards. The flames were spreading rapidly, illuminating the horrific damage to our cabin in a chaotic, dancing orange light. My father, shaking violently from the sheer adrenaline coursing through his veins, rushed to grab the thick woolen blankets from the hallway closet. He threw them over the spreading fire, desperately smothering the flames before they could consume the entire structure. The blistering, intense heat of the fire fought a losing battle against the freezing 10-degree Fahrenheit wind that was aggressively howling through the entirely shattered kitchen window. The elements clashed inside our home, creating a thick, suffocating fog of grey smoke and melted snow. Buster remained stationed at the broken window frame, his massive, broad shoulders completely filling the gaping hole in the wall. He did not attempt to chase the monster out into the deep snow. He was a loyal protector, a defensive guardian, not a reckless hunter. Thick, dark blood dripped from his wiry fur, melting the frost beneath his massive, clawed feet. The overpowering, nauseating stench of sulfur and decay that the werewolf had brought into our home began to slowly dissipate, replaced entirely by the acrid smell of scorched wood and our own cold, terrified sweat. My mother and I stood in the hallway in absolute paralyzing shock, our minds completely unable to process the sheer scale of the violence that had just unfolded mere feet away from us. I looked at Buster, truly observing him for the first time since the horrific attack had concluded. He stood entirely erect on his two hind legs, maintaining his imposing 7-foot height, staring intently into the pitch-black tree line. He was breathing heavily, his massive chest expanding and contracting with immense power. He was a magnificent, terrifying force of nature, and he had just saved our lives. The remaining hours of that terrifying night dragged on for what felt like several agonizing decades. Sleep was an absolute impossibility. We could barely force our bodies to move. The temperature outside continued to plummet, dropping down to a brutal 0 degrees Fahrenheit, and the bitter, unforgiving wind swept directly through the destroyed kitchen, turning the inside of our cabin into a freezing icebox. My mother and I huddled together in the furthest, darkest corner of the living room, wrapped tightly in every heavy winter coat and blanket we could find, physically shaking uncontrollably from both the freezing cold and the lingering, paralyzing trauma. My father stood guard near the main hallway, his white knuckles gripping his hunting rifle, though we all silently understood that the weapon was completely useless and merely served as a psychological comfort. Buster never once left his post at the window. He remained entirely vigilant, transitioning smoothly between standing on his two muscular hind legs and resting down on all fours to conserve his energy. The deep, violent lacerations across his thick chest were severe, but his sheer, unnatural biology seemed to be fighting the damage at an incredible rate. He remained completely silent, intensely scanning the dense pine forest, ensuring the demonic werewolf did not return to finish the job. The woods outside had returned to their silent state, but it was no longer the dead, suffocating silence of an ambush. It was a defeated, empty quiet. The apex predator of the area had been violently bested and driven away. Sitting there in the freezing darkness, the absolute truth of our situation settled heavily onto my chest like a physical weight. We had unknowingly harbored a creature of pure, ancient folklore, a dogman, inside our home for 7 years. He had lived among us, shared our space, and ultimately risked his own existence to defend us from an evil we could not even begin to comprehend. When the sun finally began to rise, slowly painting the snow-covered landscape in pale, freezing shades of morning light, the true, devastating extent of the destruction was fully revealed to us. Our isolated cabin was completely ruined. The heavy front door was severely splintered, the kitchen walls were torn apart, and the wooden floorboards were permanently stained with thick, dark pools of blood. I cautiously walked to the edge of the shattered window frame and looked outside into the freezing morning air. The deep snow in the backyard was completely destroyed, churned into a chaotic mess of mud and ice by the massive weight of the two battling creatures. I could clearly see a trail of heavy, bipedal footprints, each measuring easily over 14 inches in length, leading deep into the dense, forbidding woods. The tracks were accompanied by a thick, continuous trail of dark red droplets. The werewolf had fled miles into the wilderness, deeply wounded and defeated by our loyal guardian. I turned my attention back to Buster. He was looking at my parents and me with an expression that entirely broke my heart. The domestic, gentle facade he had worn for years was permanently gone. We knew exactly what he was now, and he clearly understood that the dynamic had forever shifted. The bond of love was still there, strong and entirely undeniable, but he was a wild, powerful and untamed creature of the deep woods, not a pet. Buster slowly approached us one last time, dropping heavily onto all fours, his massive, wolf-like head level with my chest. He nudged my shoulder gently with his snout, offering a silent, profoundly emotional farewell. Then, without any hesitation or looking back, our terrifying protector turned around, leaped effortlessly through the broken window, and walked away into the freezing forest, disappearing forever into the dense sea of ancient pine trees. We knew with absolute certainty that we could not stay another single night in that compromised cabin. The structural integrity of our home was entirely ruined. The freezing temperatures would kill us without a proper fire, and the overwhelming scent of blood soaking the floorboards would eventually attract other massive predators from the deep woods. Since we lived completely off the grid, with absolutely no vehicles to our name, we had no choice but to pack whatever essential survival supplies we could carry on our backs and prepare for the grueling, terrifying hike. We had to walk over 10 miles through the deep, unforgiving snow to reach the nearest paved road and flag down assistance. Every single step of that strenuous journey was an exercise in pure psychological torture. The daytime temperature hovered around 20 degrees Fahrenheit, but the physical cold was absolutely nothing compared to the intense, suffocating paranoia that gripped our minds. The vast woods, which had been our peaceful home for years, now felt like a sprawling, dangerous maze filled with unimaginable, towering horrors. Every large shadow cast by the ancient pine trees looked like a massive werewolf waiting to ambush us. Every gust of wind rushing through the branches sounded like the heavy, raspy breathing of a creature stalking us from behind. We walked in a tight defensive formation, my father taking the lead, constantly scanning the thick brush. I kept looking back over my shoulder, half expecting to see the monstrous beast returning for revenge, or perhaps desperately hoping to catch one last glimpse of Buster watching over us from a distance. But there was nothing. The forest kept its terrifying secrets entirely hidden from view as we finally reached civilization, leaving our isolated, dangerous life behind forever. Many years have passed since that brutal, life-altering winter night in the woods. I live in a brightly lit, secure apartment in the very center of Portland now, surrounded by solid concrete steel doors and the constant reassuring noise of the city. I refuse to ever go near the deep wilderness again, not even for a brief afternoon hike. The psychological scars left by that encounter are entirely permanent. I still wake up in a cold sweat in the middle of the night, vividly remembering the heavy, foul stench of sulfur and decay, and the horrifying sight of those glowing yellow eyes staring at me through the shattered glass. Most people comfortably living in cities love to dismiss ancient folklore as mere imagination, completely ignoring the vast, unexplored expanses of deep wilderness where massive, terrifying things still roam completely undetected. I know the absolute truth because I lived through the nightmare. I know that monsters absolutely exist in the dark, but I also learned that sometimes salvation comes in the most terrifying, unexpected shapes imaginable. Our family dog was a dogman, a massive, imposing creature of the shadows, and he sacrificed his own comfortable home to ensure we survived the night. I share this confession not to convince the skeptics, but to warn those who foolishly think the darkness outside their windows is empty. If you made it this far into the darkness, thank you for listening to my terrifying experience. Do not forget to hit the like button, subscribe to Mr. Nightmare Scares You, and turn on the notifications so you never miss out on these horrifying encounters. Share this video with your friends and let us know down in the comments. What would you do if you discovered your protector was actually a mythical beast? Stay safe, always keep your doors locked, and I will see you in the next nightmare.